fluent in 10 languages. I hid my skills for 5 years. Nobody expected my boss to speak Russian. The email arrived at 8:47 in the morning, and Mara had already translated it before her coffee finished brewing. She did not mean to. That was the thing nobody understood about knowing many languages. She did not sit down and decide to translate. The words simply arrived in her mind already converted, already clean. The way a person with perfect pitch hears a note and knows its name without trying. The email was from a vendor in Hamburg. It was long, technical, and written in fast business German, the kind that drops articles and stacks compound nouns into words that look like short sentences by themselves. The contracted translator the company used would have taken 40 minutes and still gotten 2 clauses wrong. Mara read it in 11 seconds. Then she opened a new reply window, and she typed the response in English. Careful English. English, with a small mistake in the 3rd sentence. A preposition placed slightly wrong, the kind of error a person makes when they learn the language in school rather than in life. She hit send. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the gray office park below, where pigeons walked along the edge of a concrete planter like they owned the place. Nobody around her knew what she had just done. That was the point. That had always been the point. Her name was Mara Calloway. She was 31 years old. She had worked at Norgate Logistics for 5 years, handling international vendor coordination from a desk in the middle of a floor that smelled like recycled air and someone's microwaved lunch. Her title was Vendor Relations Specialist. Her salary was decent. Her desk was tidy. Her performance reviews used words like reliable and thorough and great attention to detail, which were all generous ways of saying she did not cause problems, and she did not draw attention, and she showed up every day and did her work and went home. This was, by her own careful design, exactly what she wanted. She had 10 languages. She had carried them her whole life the way some people carry old photographs, not always looking at them, but never putting them down. Russian came first, from her grandmother Vera, who had arrived in the country 30 years ago, with 2 suitcases, and an iron refusal to speak anything but her native tongue inside the apartment. Mara had learned it before she learned to read, sitting on Vera's kitchen floor while borscht cooked on the stove, absorbing the sound of it the way children absorb everything, without effort, without awareness, without being able to explain how it happened. Arabic came next. They had lived for 4 years in a neighborhood where the grocery store had hand-lettered signs in 3 scripts, and the children on the street switched languages mid-sentence like changing radio stations. Mara was 7. She listened, she repeated. She got it wrong, and then right. By the time they moved away, she dreamed in 2 languages on alternating nights, which her mother found alarming, and her father found amusing. Mandarin was different. Mandarin she chose. She was 19, in her first year of college, sitting in a language elective she had signed up for because it fit her schedule, and something happened on the first day that she could not fully explain. The tones, the way meaning changed with pitch, the way the same syllable could be 4 different words depending on how your voice moved. It opened something in her mind that felt like a door she had not known was there. She stayed in the class. She took the next one. She found recordings online and listened to them while she walked across campus. Within 2 years, she was reading novels in it. French came from a roommate named Claire, who spoke it on the phone with her mother every Sunday, and who did not mind when Mara sat nearby and listened. Turkish came from a documentary she fell into one night and could not stop watching, followed by books, followed by an online tutor she paid out of her grocery budget for 18 months. Portuguese from a job she almost took in Lisbon before she changed her mind. Spanish, because it would have been strange not to, living where she lived. Polish from a neighbor named Mr. Wojciech, who was 80 years old and lonely, and who had nobody to talk to in his own language, and who taught her in exchange for help carrying his groceries every Saturday. Italian she learned mostly to read. She had never spoken it much to anyone, but she could read a newspaper in it without stopping. 10 languages, not 10 phrases, not tourist vocabulary. 10 languages in which she could think, argue, read, write, and understand the joke before it finished. She had told none of this to anyone at Norgate. Not on her resume, not in her interview, not during 5 years of daily work with international vendors, foreign clients, and colleagues who sometimes struggled with documents in other languages right in front of her, while she sat quietly and watched and said nothing. This was not an accident. It was a decision. She had made it on the first morning of her first week, sitting at the desk that was now hers, reading through the company's vendor list and seeing names from 12 different countries and feeling the familiar pull, the sense that she was about to become useful in a very particular and very exhausting way. She had been useful in that way her entire life. She knew exactly what it looked like. It looked like being the child standing next to her mother at the hospital front desk, translating symptoms into English and English into reassurance and back again, while her mother's eyes went wide with the effort of not crying. It looked like being 17 and sitting in a government office translating documents that contained information she was too young to be responsible for, but nobody else was there to do it. It looked like being the bridge. Always the bridge. A bridge does not get to choose who walks across it. She had decided at 26, on her first morning at Norgate, that she was done being the bridge, not done knowing languages. She could no more stop knowing them than she could stop knowing her own name, but done offering them up automatically, the way she had always done, the way everyone around her had always expected. At Norgate she would be Mara Calloway, vendor relations specialist. She would be reliable and thorough. She would have great attention to detail. She would be nothing more and nothing less. For 5 years, it had worked perfectly. She watched Colin from accounting struggle through a French contract on a Tuesday afternoon, and she watched him spend 3 hours on something that would have taken her 4 minutes. And she felt a small and complicated feeling she had learned to recognize, part guilt, part relief, part something she did not have a name for. She let him struggle. She looked back at her screen. She typed a follow-up email to a vendor in Lyon, in English, with a small mistake in the second paragraph. She watched a new junior coordinator named Pete try to communicate with a supplier in Istanbul over the phone, his voice getting louder, the way people's voices did when they thought volume might substitute for vocabulary. She watched Pete's face go red with frustration. She turned in her chair so her back was to him. She put on her headphones. She turned them up. She watched a client from Moscow sit through a conference call in which every third sentence had to be relayed through a translator who charged by the hour, and who clearly did not understand the difference between industry-specific shipping terms and everyday conversational ones. The call ran 40 minutes over schedule. She watched her manager, a patient man named Glenn Harper, press his fingers to his forehead and breathe very carefully. She watched the Moscow client's expression shift from professional to barely contained frustration. She watched all of it. She said nothing. There was a particular skill to this, and she had become very good at it. The skill was not simply silence. Silence was easy. The skill was occupying her face and her body with the correct amount of neutral, engaged attention, the look of a person who is following along, who is interested, who is perhaps understanding around 60% of what is happening and feels fine about that. She had practiced this expression the way other people practiced presentations. She knew when to nod. She knew when to write something in her notebook. She knew how to make her eyes go thoughtful without looking like she understood more than a person in her position was supposed to understand. It was work. Most people did not realize how much work it was. The hiding was almost as exhausting as the knowing. But she did it. She did it every day. She came in. She sat down. She read the German emails in 11 seconds and replied in careful, imperfect English. She watched colleagues struggle and said nothing. She listened to Russian conference calls with her face arranged in a mask of polite, partial understanding. And then she went home. And she was, in the privacy of her apartment, the person she actually was. She listened to podcasts in Arabic. She read novels in Mandarin. She watched television in Turkish and French on alternating evenings. She spoke to her grandmother Vera on the phone every Sunday in Russian, and for that 1 hour each week, something in her chest loosened. Some knot she did not fully notice she was carrying unwound a little. On Monday morning, she would tie it back up. She was very good at this. She had convinced herself she was at peace with it. The email from Hamburg sat in the sent folder. The pigeons moved along the planter outside. Colin from accounting walked past her desk with a French contract under his arm, and a look on his face that suggested the afternoon was not going well. Mara picked up her coffee. She looked at her screen. She opened the next email in her queue, which was from a supplier in Warsaw, written in Polish, and her mind converted it before she even finished reading the subject line. She began typing her reply. English. Careful. Small mistake in the third sentence. Just like always. The day moved forward. The floor hummed with the sound of ordinary work. Outside, the pigeons claimed the planter and held it. Nobody suspected anything. That was the thing about hiding in plain sight. You had to be so ordinary that people looked right through you. You had to be so predictably unremarkable that the idea of you being remarkable never occurred to them. Mara had spent 5 years making sure that idea never had a chance to form in anyone's mind. She was good at it. She was, she told herself, completely fine with it. She hit send. 5 years was a long time to carry something and call it a choice. Mara had not always called it that. In the beginning, those first weeks at Norgate, when the decision was still new and the edges of it still felt clean, she had called it a boundary. A reasonable, adult, self-protective boundary. She had read about boundaries. She understood them. She had spent enough years being the person everyone else needed her to be, that setting one had felt, in that first week, like standing up after a very long time on her knees. But boundaries are supposed to feel like freedom. And by the end of the second year, this one had started to feel like a room with the door locked from the inside. She did not tell anyone that part. The first real test had come 4 months into the job. There was a colleague then named Philip, who handled freight partnerships, and who one afternoon stopped at her desk with a printed email in his hand and a helpless look on his face. The email was from a company in Ankara. It was in Turkish. Philip held it out to her with the particular expression people wear when they are hoping someone nearby is secretly the solution to their problem. Mara looked at it. The Turkish was simple, direct. A shipping delay, a proposed reroute, a question about penalty clauses. She could have read it aloud to him in under a minute. She looked at the email for 3 full seconds. Then she said, honestly and without warmth, I don't really have a background in Turkish. Sorry. Philip thanked her and walked away. She watched him go to the copy machine and begin printing. She assumed something related to finding a translator. She turned back to her screen. Her hands were perfectly still on the keyboard. She did not shake. She did not feel guilty, not then. Not in any way she recognized as guilt. She told herself it was fine. She told herself this more times over the years than she could count, and the more she said it, the less she heard it. The thing nobody tells you about hiding a skill is that the skill does not cooperate. It does not go quiet just because you want it to. Mara would sit in meetings where vendors called in from Frankfurt or Istanbul or Sao Paulo, and her mind would be running a simultaneous translation she never asked for, never wanted, could not stop. It was like having a second conversation playing on top of the official one, always, without pause. She would hear the German client on the speakerphone make a comment that the translator rendered as, "We are open to reconsidering the terms," when what the client had actually said, with a very specific, and not small distinction, was, "We expect this to be reconsidered." One sentence was an invitation, the other was a demand. She heard the difference. She sat with it. She wrote it in her notebook in shorthand that nobody would have been able to read, and then she crossed it out. She watched the contract go unsigned for 3 more weeks, while both sides thought the other was being unreasonable. That was the Turkish email test. That was the German contract. That was Warsaw. That was Lyon. That was a call with a client from Beijing that went 40 minutes over time, because the interpreter they used clearly had a business vocabulary that stopped somewhere around the level of a second-year student, and Mara sat in the corner of the conference room with her notebook open, and her pen moving, and her face wearing the expression she had perfected, and the inside of her mind running at a speed and precision that nobody in that room would have believed. Afterward, Glenn Harper, her manager, stood in the hallway with his coffee and said to nobody in particular, "We really need a better solution for these calls." He said it the way people say things. They do not expect to be answered. Mara walked past him. She said, "Yeah, those are tough." She went back to her desk. She put on her headphones. She was aware, in some part of herself she did not look at directly, that she was watching real problems go unsolved, because she had decided her comfort was more important than solving them. She did not allow herself to linger on this thought for long. She had her reasons. Her reasons were real. She returned to them regularly, the way you return to a map when you are not sure you are going the right way. She had been 12 years old the first time she understood that being useful in a language could trap you. Her family had moved 3 times before she was 10. Each new neighborhood brought new languages, and each new language became, within months, a responsibility. She was the child who spoke English. She was the one who made phone calls. She was the one who explained things to clerks and filled in forms, and sat in waiting rooms translating what the doctor said into something her parents could hold on to. She did not resent them for this. She understood, even as a child, that they had no other option, but understanding something and being unaffected by it were not the same thing. By the time she was 15, she had learned to be very careful about who knew what she could do. If the neighbors knew she spoke Arabic, she became the neighbor's free translation service. If her teachers knew she spoke Russian, she became the unofficial interpreter for every Russian-speaking student in the school. People did not mean to take advantage. They simply saw a resource and reached for it, the way you reach for a light switch in a dark room without thinking about whether the lamp wants to be turned on. She had been the lamp for a long time. At 26, on her first morning at Norgate, she had flipped the switch herself. She thought about this on a Thursday in her 3rd year, as she sat across from a new hire named Owen, who was young and eager, and who had come to her desk to ask if she knew any resources for learning basic German phrases, since he had a vendor call coming up and he was nervous. She liked Owen. He reminded her of how she had felt at 22. That wide-open quality, that willingness to just try something and see what happened. She told him about a free language app. She gave him 3 tips for the call. She did not tell him she could conduct the entire call herself in fluent German and have a written summary ready in under an hour. He thanked her and went back to his desk. She watched him put in his earbuds and start the app. He mispronounced the first phrase so badly she had to look away to keep her expression steady. She felt something then. Not guilt exactly. Something quieter. Something that sat in the center of her chest and did not move. She called it protecting herself and went back to work. By the 4th year, she had started noticing things she had not let herself notice before. She noticed that she was never bored by the work itself, the logistics, the coordination, the problem-solving, but she was often bored by the version of herself she was allowed to be at work. She noticed that Sunday evenings, when she spoke to her grandmother on the phone in Russian, she laughed more in that 1 hour than she did in an entire week at the office. She noticed that she had begun spending more and more of her evenings with languages, not studying new ones, but living in the ones she already had, because they were the place where she felt most like herself. She had not connected these observations into a conclusion. She was not ready to. But they were there. They sat in her mind, the way water sits just below a surface, waiting for pressure, or heat, or the right kind of moment to change its state. She was in her 5th year when the right kind of moment began to gather on the horizon, though she did not know that yet. It came, as most things do, in the form of a person. Not the person she expected, not in the way she expected. Glenn Harper called a team meeting on a Wednesday to announce that the company had hired a new regional director, someone from the European operations side of the business who would be overseeing their floor along with 2 others. He said the name once, reading it from his notes with the careful pronunciation of a man doing his best with something unfamiliar. The name was Dmitry Volkov. Mara heard it. Her pen stopped moving. She looked at her notebook. She looked back at Glenn. Glenn was already moving on to the next item on his agenda, something about the 4th quarter review schedule. She wrote nothing in her notebook for the rest of the meeting. That evening, she sat in her car in the parking garage for 4 minutes before starting the engine. An Arabic podcast played from her phone. A long conversation between 2 historians about trade routes, dense and comfortable and full of vocabulary she loved. She listened without hearing it. Dmitry Volkov. She did not know what to do with the feeling that had settled into her chest during that meeting. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was something older and more complicated. The feeling of standing at a door you have passed 100 times and noticing, for the first time, that you have never tried the handle. She started the car. She drove home. She made dinner. She spoke to her grandmother on Sunday and said nothing about the new director or the feeling in her chest or any of it. She told herself it probably meant nothing. She was almost right. Dmitry Volkov arrived on a Tuesday, which felt correct to Mara in a way she could not explain. Tuesday had the quality of a disruption, Something that happened before you were fully settled into the week, but after the brief illusion of Monday's fresh start had worn off. She saw him for the first time at 9:15 in the morning, when Glenn brought him around the floor for introductions. Mara had her screen open and her headphones around her neck, not in her ears, because she had learned long ago that headphones in the ears during introductions read as rude, and she did not want to be memorable in any way, including a negative one. She was not prepared for him. This was not a romantic thing. She wanted to be clear about this, even to herself, especially to herself. It was something else, something more unsettling actually, because it was harder to name. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and wore his jacket the way Europeans sometimes did, with a slight ease to it that Americans tended not to manage. His hair was dark with the beginning of gray at the sides. He was perhaps 45. He had the kind of face that looked like it had spent time in weather, which was not something that could be said about most people who worked in logistics management. But none of that was what caught her. What caught her was when Glenn said her name. And this is Mara Calloway. She handles international vendor coordination. And Dmitry Volkov looked at her and said, "Good morning." And there was something in the second syllable of morning. Something in the back of the vowel. Small. Brief. Almost nothing. Almost. She heard it the way she heard everything, completely, without trying. His English was fluent. Genuinely, deeply fluent. Not the effortful fluency of someone who had studied it carefully, but the real kind, the kind that came from years of actual use. His vocabulary was precise. His grammar was correct. His accent was a strange and well-blended thing, British-shaped from education, she guessed, but with something underneath that his years of practice had not fully covered. A lean, a slight particular way of holding certain consonants. She had grown up listening to that lean. She knew exactly what it meant. She shook his hand. She said, "Welcome to the floor." She smiled the professional, warm, appropriately brief smile she had calibrated over 5 years. She looked back at her screen before he had fully turned away. Glenn led him on. They stopped at Owen's desk. She heard Owen say something enthusiastic, and slightly too fast. She did not turn around. She put her headphones on. She looked at the email in front of her, which was from a supplier in Guangzhou, and which she had read in full before she reached the third line. She told herself she had imagined the accent. She was good at hearing things that were not there. She had spent years in rooms where people spoke languages she knew, and she had trained herself so well to appear not to notice that sometimes she went too far in the other direction, and began doubting her own ear. She had not imagined it. By the end of the first week, she was certain. She had been in 3 meetings where Dmitry spoke, and she had catalogued everything. The way he said process with just a breath too much emphasis on the first syllable. The way he said schedule, in the British way, which was learned, but then occasionally said colleagues, with a slight pull toward a sound that did not exist in British English, and did not exist in American English, but existed very specifically in Russian. The way he sometimes paused a half-beat before idioms, the way people do when they are translating an idiom they know exists but which does not map neatly from their first language into their second. He was Russian. His first language was Russian. She was as sure of this as she had ever been of anything. She told no one. She was aware this was almost funny, given the circumstances. A woman who had hidden 10 languages for 5 years had now identified a hidden language in the man who was her new boss. She did not find it funny. She found it interesting, in the way a very complicated problem is interesting, the kind of interesting that keeps you awake. She began watching him the way she watched everything, from a careful distance, with her face arranged in the correct expression, her attention looking like nothing more than ordinary professional engagement. What she saw was this. Dmitry Volkov was competent, genuinely competent, which she had not fully expected, because competence in senior management was never guaranteed. He ran meetings efficiently. He asked precise questions. He had clearly read every document before any meeting in which that document would be discussed, which was rarer than it should have been. He remembered names. He followed through on things he said he would follow through on. He also watched people. She noticed this about him because she did the same thing, and she recognized the quality of it, the slight stillness, the way his attention would fix on a person or a situation for just a moment longer than casual interest required. He was reading rooms. He was reading people. He was very good at it. She wondered, sometimes, what he saw when he read her. She made sure there was nothing to see. The second week he stopped by her desk, not in the introductory way, the way he had during the first-day tour, but with purpose, with a printed document in his hand. He set it down in front of her. It was a vendor agreement from a company based in Stuttgart. He said that Glenn had mentioned she was good with international vendor correspondence and he wanted her opinion on the language of the agreement, specifically, whether the terms around delivery liability were as straightforward as the translation suggested. She looked at the document. The English translation was underneath the German original, printed side by side. She had read the German in the time it took to place the document on her desk. She looked at the English translation. She said, "The translation looks reasonable to me. The delivery terms seem standard." This was true. The translation was reasonable. The delivery terms were standard. She had said nothing inaccurate. She had also said nothing about the fact that the German original had a specific phrase in paragraph 4 that the translation had softened from strictly binding delivery window to agreed delivery period, which was a meaningful difference in the event of a dispute. He looked at her for a moment. Not long. A second or two. The kind of look that was professionally neutral, but had something underneath it she could not quite read. "Thank you," he said. He picked up the document and went back to his office. She waited until he turned the corner. Then she looked at her screen. Her reflection looked back at her from a dark strip of monitor border. A small, upside-down version of her face, composed, expressionless. She wondered why she had not told him about paragraph 4. She knew the answer. The same reason she had not told anyone about anything for 5 years. Because telling him would mean revealing that she had read the German, and revealing that would open a door she had locked from the inside. The document went to legal. Legal spent a week on it. They caught the paragraph 4 issue eventually. She told herself, this proved she had been right not to say anything. The system worked without her. She almost believed it. 3 weeks after he arrived, there was a moment in the break room that she thought about for longer than it deserved. She was making coffee. He came in for coffee. There was no one else there. They stood on opposite sides of the machine, and there was one of those brief, ordinary silences that happen in break rooms between people who know each other professionally, but not personally. He said, "How long have you been here?" She said, 5 years. He said, "Do you enjoy it?" She said, "I do. It's good work." He looked at his coffee. He said, 5 years in the same role is a long time. Either the work is very good or the person is very patient. She looked at him. He was not being unkind. He was being direct, which she had come to understand was simply how he was. She said, "A bit of both, maybe." He smiled. It was a brief smile, the kind that reached but did not commit. He took his coffee and went back to his office. She stood in the break room with her own coffee, and felt the quiet settle back in, and thought about what he had said. Either the work is very good, or the person is very patient. She had never thought of it as patience. She had thought of it as a decision, a reasonable, self-protective decision that she had made once and maintained. But patience implied waiting. Patience implied that the waiting would end. Patience implied there was something you were being patient for. She went back to her desk. She put her headphones on. She opened the email from the supplier in Warsaw. She was aware, in some part of herself she was becoming less able to ignore, that the knot in her chest was not loosening the way it used to on Sundays. It had been tight all week. It had been tight, in fact, since the Tuesday Dmitry Volkov arrived on the floor and said good morning with that particular sound in the second vowel. She typed her reply to Warsaw. English. Careful. Small mistake in the 4th sentence this time. She had started varying the placement. The floor hummed. The ventilation moved the air in its dull, recycled way. Somewhere behind her, Owen was practicing German phrases with his phone turned low. And in the office at the end of the hall, behind a glass wall she had not looked at directly all morning, a man who was not what he appeared to be, sat at his desk and read documents with the careful attention of someone who understood, better than most, that what a thing said on the surface was not always what it meant underneath. She did not look at the office. She pulled up the next email in her queue. It was from a freight company in Moscow. She stared at the subject line for 3 full seconds. Then she clicked it open and began to read, not translating, because there was no gap between the Russian and the understanding. There never was. And the words arrived in her mind the way water arrives in a low place, completely, without effort, without any distance at all. She closed the email. She forwarded it to the contracted translation service with a note that said, "Please prioritize this one. Time sensitive." She sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling. She breathed once, slowly. Then she straightened up, and she went back to work, and she did not look at the office at the end of the hall. Not once. For the rest of the day. The call came in on a Friday, at 10 minutes past 2, which was the kind of time when most of the floor had settled into the slow, slightly unfocused rhythm of an afternoon that was simply running out the clock toward the weekend. Mara was at her desk with a document from a supplier in Lyon, working through the English version with a red pen. She always used a red pen, because it made the work feel deliberate, when she heard the sound of the conference room filling up faster than it usually did. Chairs, voices, the particular hurried quality of people who have been pulled from what they were doing before they were ready. She looked up. Glenn Harper was moving past her desk, with his laptop under his arm, and the particular expression on his face that she had learned, over 5 years, to associate with situations that were not quite emergencies, but were moving in that direction. He caught her eye, and said briefly, "Quarterly review call. Suvorov is on at 2:15. Then he was gone. She looked back at her document. She knew the name Suvorov. Everybody on the floor knew the name, in the way people know the names of clients who generate a significant portion of the company's revenue, with respect, with a slight tension, with the awareness that when things went wrong with that account, they went wrong loudly. Anton Suvorov was the director of operations for a large freight and distribution company based in Moscow. His account had been with Norgate for 7 years. He conducted all his business calls in Russian. Norgate had always used a contracted interpreter for the calls, a woman named Helen who was efficient and professional, and who charged by the hour. Mara did not move. She heard people settling into the conference room. She heard the laptop being opened, the sound of a video call loading. She heard Glenn say something to someone about making sure the interpreter line was connected. Then she heard, with perfect clarity, because the conference room door was not fully closed, a voice that was not Glenn's say, "Helen called. She's sick. The agency says they don't have another Russian interpreter available until Monday." There was a pause. "The call is in 4 minutes," Glenn said. Another pause. "Can we reschedule?" Glenn's voice, very even, very controlled. "Suvorov has specifically said he does not reschedule quarterly reviews. Last time we had a technical issue and pushed it 15 minutes. He sent a formal note about professionalism standards." Mara's pen was still. She was looking at the Lyon document and not seeing it. She heard Dmitri's voice then. He had been in the conference room already, she realized. He said, "Let me know when he connects. We will manage." She did not know exactly what she thought he meant by that. She assumed he meant they would conduct the call in English and hope Suvorov's own English was serviceable. It usually was at a surface level, though she knew from overhearing previous calls that Suvorov became noticeably less cooperative when he felt he could not express himself fully, and his English tended to fail him precisely in the situations that required the most precision, during disagreements, during renegotiations, during any conversation where the difference between approximately correct and exactly correct mattered. The call connected at 2:17. She could hear it through the door. She was not trying to hear it. She was trying, in fact, to read the Lyon document and be exactly where she was paid to be, doing exactly what she was paid to do. But the conference room was close, and the door was not fully latched, and the sound carried. Suvorov's voice came through the speakers. He said good afternoon in Russian. Fast, businesslike, the greeting of a man who had allotted exactly as much time to pleasantries as they deserved, which was not much. There was a pause. Glenn said, in English, "Good afternoon, Mr. Suvorov. Thank you for joining us today." Another pause. Longer. Then Suvorov's voice again, in Russian. And this time Mara was paying attention despite herself, and what he said was, not a greeting, not pleasantries. He said something had changed in the quarterly numbers, and he wanted to understand the liability clause adjustment. and he needed someone to explain it to him clearly, because the documents he had received were not matching what he had been told to expect. This was not a small thing. This was the opening of a serious conversation about a contract adjustment, delivered in the first 90 seconds of a call, to a room that had no interpreter. Glenn said, in English, "Of course, we want to address all your questions today." There was a long pause from Suvorov's end. Mara knew what that pause contained. It was the pause of a man who had just realized he was not going to be understood. Then she heard something she was not fully prepared for. Dmitri spoke. In Russian. Not fluent English, with a trace underneath Russian. Real Russian. Fully present, fully native. The Russian of someone who had grown up with it in their mouth. And he said, calmly and directly, that he understood Suvorov's concern, and that the liability clause adjustment was a point they had flagged for discussion in today's call, and he wanted to make sure there was no ambiguity about the terms before they proceeded. The conference room went quiet, in the way rooms go quiet, when something shifts that cannot be unshifted. Mara's pen was on the desk. She was not reading anything. Suvorov responded. His whole register had changed. The tension in his voice was not gone, but it was different. It was the productive tension of a man who had just learned he was in a conversation rather than a performance. He said 3 things rapidly: what the document said, what he had been told it would say, and what he needed the difference to be explained. And then, because the room still had other people in it who needed to follow this, and because Dmitri was fielding the substance of Suvorov's question, while also presumably trying to maintain a meeting that had several other participants who spoke no Russian at all, there was a gap, a brief, operational gap, the kind that opens in meetings when 2 things need to happen at once, and there is only one person who can do them. Dmitri said something to Suvorov about the specific clause number. Then he turned. She could not see him turn, but she could hear the direction of his voice change, and she heard him say to the room, in English, "The clause in question is section 8.4. He is asking about the revision to the liability window. I need someone to pull the document and confirm the current language." The room moved. Papers. Laptop keys. And then Suvorov said something else. He said it in Russian, and it was fast and specific, and it was about the penalty schedule in the event of a delivery failure, and he used a legal term, a very specific Russian legal term that had a precise meaning in the context of international freight contracts. And Mara heard it from her desk, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that when it got relayed into English it was going to come out wrong. She heard Owen start to read from the document. His English summary of the clause was accurate as far as it went, but it missed the specific term Suvorov had used entirely, which meant Suvorov was about to hear a response that did not address his actual question, and based on what she knew of Suvorov from 5 years of peripheral awareness, he would understand this as evasion rather than error, and he would respond accordingly. She stood up. She did not decide to stand up. Her body made the decision and she followed it. She was at the conference room door before she had finished the thought. She pushed it open. 7 people looked at her. Glenn looked at her. Owen looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been interrupted mid-sentence. Dmitri looked at her. He looked at her differently than the others. She could not have said exactly what the difference was. She would think about it later, many times, and still not be able to say it precisely. It was something in the quality of his attention, not surprised, not confused, but very still, like a person who has been waiting at a corner and has just heard, from a distance, the sound of something coming. She looked at the speakerphone in the center of the table. She looked at Glenn. She said quietly, in English, "He's asking about the penalty clause under international arbitration conditions. The term he used is specific. The response needs to address that directly, or he'll think we're avoiding the question." The room was very still. Glenn said, very carefully, "Mara." She looked at the speakerphone. She had made a decision, and she was past the place where she could unmake it. She said, in Russian, clear and direct, "Mr. Suvorov, I understand the question. We are looking at the specific clause now. The penalty schedule in section 9.2 addresses the arbitration condition you mentioned. Can you give us 90 seconds to pull the precise language?" There was a pause. Then Suvorov said, in Russian, "Finally." Just that one word, finally, with the exhale of someone who had been holding their breath. The conference room did not make a sound. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at the speakerphone and did not look at anyone's face because she was not ready for what she would see there. Dmitri said something then. He said it in Russian, and he said it quietly, a continuation of the operational conversation with Suvorov, holding the thread while the others in the room found the document, his voice steady and professional, and completely without drama. And then, in the 30 seconds that followed while Glenn pulled up section 9.2, and Owen found the relevant paragraph, and the room reorganized itself around this new reality, Dmitri looked at her. Just looked at her. No expression she could catalog, no surprise she could point to. Just the quality of attention she had noticed the very first time he had walked onto the floor. That slight stillness, that fixing. She looked back. For 1 second. 2. He said, in Russian, not to the speakerphone, not to the room, but to her, quietly, in a register nobody else in the room could follow. How long? She knew exactly what he was asking. She said nothing. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he turned back to the speakerphone. He said something to Suvorov. The call moved forward. Mara walked to the table. She sat down in the empty chair beside Owen. She put her hand out for the document. Owen gave it to her. She looked at section 9.2. She found the relevant clause. She translated it. At the table, in the conference room, in front of 7 people and a client on a speakerphone in Moscow, in the clearest and most precise Russian she had spoken, in a professional setting in 5 years. The call ran 22 minutes. It ended well. Suvorov said goodbye with the warmth of a man who had gotten what he came for. Glenn said he would send the revised summary by end of day. The call disconnected. The room was quiet. Then everyone began talking at once. The call ended at 14 minutes to 3. By 3 o'clock, Mara was back at her desk. She had walked out of the conference room in the gap between the call ending and people turning to each other, which was a gap of perhaps 4 seconds. She had moved quickly and with direction, the way a person moves when they know exactly where they are going, which was misleading, because she had no idea where she was going. She only knew that she needed to be somewhere that was not the middle of that room, surrounded by those faces and that particular quality of stunned attention. She sat down. She put her headphones on. She looked at the Lyon document. She did not read it. She was aware of the sound of the conference room emptying. She was aware of Glenn's voice in the hallway, and Owen's, and 2 or 3 others. She kept her eyes on the document. She kept her headphones on. She made herself look like a person who had returned to work. After 6 minutes, Glenn appeared beside her desk. She took her headphones off. He did not say anything immediately. Glenn Harper was not the kind of man who said things before he was ready to say them, which was one of the qualities she had genuinely appreciated about him for 5 years. He looked at her desk. He looked at her. He said, "How long have you spoken Russian?" She said, "A long time." He said, "Is there anything else I should know?" She considered this. She said, "Probably yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay. Just that. Okay." As if this were a manageable piece of information, which perhaps, to Glenn, it was. He was a practical man, and practical men tended to reorganize around new information rather than argue with it. He went back to his office. Owen stopped by, 20 minutes later. He leaned against the desk divider and said, in the voice of someone who was genuinely trying to process something, "So do you speak other languages or just—" "A few," she said. He waited. She said, 9 others. He stared at her. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He said, 9, including Russian. He stared at her for another moment. Then he laughed. Not an unkind laugh, a stunned one, the kind that comes out of a person before they have finished deciding how to feel. He shook his head. He went back to his desk. She looked at her screen. At 4:17, she received a calendar invitation for a meeting the following Monday morning, 9 o'clock. The organizer was Dmitry Volkov. The title was simply, Discussion, no other attendees, no agenda listed. She accepted it. She did not know what else to do. She put her headphones back on. She looked at the Lyon document. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray and still, the kind of gray that comes before rain, everything held at the same breath. She thought about the word he had said to her in the conference room, The quiet one, just to her. How long? She had not answered. She had let the call move forward and she had done what she came in to do, and then she had left and she had not answered. She thought about answering it now, in the privacy of her own mind, where nobody could hear it. 5 years. 5 years of forwarding Russian emails to a contracted service. 5 years of listening to calls and watching mistakes compound. 5 years of sitting very still, with a very controlled face, while the inside of her mind moved at a speed and precision that would have changed almost every difficult conversation she had witnessed, had she allowed it into the room. 5 years of telling herself it was a boundary, a reasonable, self-protective choice made by an adult who understood her own needs. The rain started. She heard it against the window before she saw it. A soft, generalized sound, like something being released. She was aware that Monday's meeting was not going to be a simple thing. Dmitri was not a simple man. He had walked into a company where she had successfully hidden herself for 5 years, and within weeks he had— She stopped at this thought. Within weeks he had what, exactly? She thought about the break room. Either the work is very good or the person is very patient. She thought about the document he had brought to her desk, the Stuttgart agreement, the way he had looked at her afterward. She thought about the conference room. How long? Had he known? Or was he guessing? She did not know. She would not know until Monday. And there was something about that uncertainty that was, unexpectedly, not entirely unpleasant. It was the feeling of a problem she did not yet have all the pieces to, which was, if she was honest, her favorite kind. She turned back to the Lyon document. She read it properly this time, in English, because the English was what they needed, and the English was what she was paid to produce. She made notes. She flagged 2 clauses for follow-up. She worked until 5:30. She packed her bag. She shut down her screen. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. And while she waited, she thought, not about Monday's meeting, not about Dmitri or Glenn or what any of it would mean for her title or her role or her carefully maintained anonymity. She thought about her grandmother Vera, who had arrived in this country with 2 suitcases and had spent 30 years refusing to give up the language that made her herself, not out of stubbornness, not out of failure to adapt, but because she understood, in the bone-deep way that only certain people understand it, that a language is not just a way of speaking. It is a place you live in. Mara had been living in 10 places her entire life. She had simply stopped letting anyone visit. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. The building held its sound for a moment, that particular hum of a place finishing its day, and then the elevator began to move, and she descended, and outside the rain came down in the gray and patient way that rain has when it is not in a hurry, when it has all the time in the world, when it knows that whatever it is looking for will eventually surface. She walked through the lobby. She pushed the front door open. She stepped into the rain and did not run for her car, because the rain was not that heavy, and she was not, for the first time in a long time, in any particular hurry. On Monday she would sit across from a man who had, quietly and without announcement, already figured out more about her than she had intended anyone here to know. She would answer his question. Not the short version, maybe not even the clean version, possibly the true version, which was longer and messier, and went further back than most people were willing to follow. She had been patient for 5 years. Maybe that was, it turned out, exactly what it was. Patience. The waiting kind. The kind that knows it is waiting even when it is pretending not to. She got to her car. She opened the door. She sat down. She plugged in her phone and an Arabic podcast started playing. The historians again. The same long conversation about trade routes. The same dense and comfortable vocabulary she had been listening to all week. She did not start the car right away. She listened to the Arabic for a moment. Then she switched to Russian, to a news program her grandmother had once recommended. Voices she knew the shape of, the sound of a language that had been in her life longer than almost anything else. She sat with it. Then she started the car, and she drove home, and she did not have the answer to any of the important questions yet, but she had, for the first time in 5 years, sitting in the rain in a parking garage at the end of an ordinary Friday that had not been ordinary at all, the feeling that the door was still there, that the handle was there, that she had always known how to use it. She just had to decide if she was ready to open it. She thought she might be. She thought, almost certainly, that she was.